Boldwood presents Come Rain or Shine, written by Sarah Bennett and read by Fran Burgoyne. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Where have you been, Natasha? The feathers on her mother's fascinator bristled in echo of the indignation in her words as Tasha Blake climbed out of her car next to the pretty stone church that served the village community of Little Nedling. It was more a squeeze than a climb as the car park was packed to overflowing, and the only space Tasha had been able to find was next to a Mercedes estate with 2 wheels over the white line. She breathed in as she inched her way out of her much smaller hatchback, wishing she'd found the time to take a trip through the car wash. The last thing she wanted was to be standing at the font later with a dirty smear across her backside. The last thing she wanted was to be standing at the font full stop, especially on Valentine's Day. But refusing her sister Danielle's invitation to be godmother to her second child would have ostracised her from the family for good. "Mind your clothes!" Victoria Blake's tone was even sharper as her unforgiving gaze swept her daughter from head to toe. "I am minding my clothes," Tasha responded through gritted teeth. "If whoever owns this monstrosity hadn't parked so badly, I wouldn't have to mind them, would I? If you'd arrived in good time, you would have had your choice of parking spaces. Now come here and let me look at you." Tasha closed her eyes for a second as she swallowed down a retort. There was no point in saying anything about the horrendous journey she'd fought around the N25 and along the A12 thanks to several accidents caused by the awful weather, because her mother would simply point out she should have travelled down the night before. Telling her mother she couldn't have come down because she was working would have only opened another can of worms about her prioritising her job over her family, especially at the weekend. Her mother always had an answer for everything, and they had a long day ahead. If they started fighting, the waterworks would be next, and Tasha would be to blame for spoiling Danielle's special day. So she held her peace and silently counted the hours until she was able to escape back to Reading, while her mother brushed the back of her blouse as if she were a grubby child. "Did you have to wear trousers?" Victoria grumbled. "I can't remember the last time I saw you in a dress." Couldn't she? Tasha could remember it as if it were yesterday. She'd been standing on a platform in the bridal shop while the dressmaker pinned and tucked and adjusted after Tasha had caught her fiancé in bed with his ex-girlfriend 3 weeks before their wedding. A wedding that, like every other milestone occasion for generations of their family, had been due to be held in this very church in the heart of the Suffolk countryside. "I didn't want to be cold," Tasha replied, keeping her tone light. If her mother was going to pretend all of this was fine, then she was more than happy to play along. The sun was shining, a pleasant contrast to the torrential rain she'd battled through for most of her journey, but there was little warmth in it. As though to underline her point, the February wind made itself known as it whistled across the car park and sent the feathers and net bow pinned to her mother's head dancing. Should have bought a thermal vest while I was at it. She'd chosen the pale pink suit somewhat against her better judgment, thanks to a persuasive sales assistant who'd assured her it was the perfect choice for a christening. There must have been something wrong with the lighting in the changing room, because when she'd put it on that morning, Tasha had realised the colour did not suit her ginger hair. At all. She'd surveyed her wardrobe in a panic, but all her other suits were dark, sensible business wear. The handful of dresses she owned were the kind you accessorised with a cocktail while sitting at a beachside bar, and were either too short or too low cut for church. Using half a bottle of curl tamer, she'd managed to coax her hair into a sleek, severe twist at the nape of her neck, and had softened the look with a couple of flower slides she'd picked up in an accessory shop. Escaping her mother's clutches, Tasha reached into the back seat and managed to retrieve her jacket without incident. No hat? Stop fussing, Mum, please. Tasha locked her car and slid the keys into her jacket pocket. At least wearing a suit meant she hadn't needed to worry about finding a handbag to match her outfit. She wasn't a handbag type of woman, much preferring the practicality of the small Kipling rucksack she used for work and, well, for everything else, really. I brought a spare one with me. I'll fetch it from the car. Give me 2 ticks. I think people are going in, Tasha called after her mother's retreating back, even though the people milling around outside the church showed no sign of it. She watched Victoria for a few more seconds before breaking into a jog to catch up with her. The flowers will be fine, Mum. Leave it. Nonsense. You want to look your best for the photos, don't you? Her mother turned to wave an imperious hand towards where Tasha's father was. I need the keys. Barely breaking eye contact with the man next to him, her dad pulled the remote from his pocket and pointed it at the back of the BMW. The lights flashed in unison with the clunk of the locks. Her mother opened the boot and rooted around in a large John Lewis carrier bag before pulling out what looked like the remains of a dead chicken. She tried to hand it to Tasha, who shoved her hands quickly in her pockets as she backed up a step. No way am I wearing that! What's wrong with it? The feathers on Victoria's almost matching fascinator quivered again. Nothing, Tasha replied hastily. It's lovely. It's just not me. Her mother's sigh was one Tasha knew all too well. Victoria Blake was wondering yet again how she'd managed to raise 2 daughters so close in age and yet so radically different. Everyone suits a fascinator, darling. That's the whole point of them. Tasha shot a look of appeal across the car park to where her father was still chatting away. Rather than coming to her rescue, he sent her a cheery wave before bending down to scoop up the small boy who was charging past, waving what looked like half a tree branch. Mason was Danielle's son, and had rolled right past the terrible 2s, through the tempestuous 3s, and was deeply embedded in the fucking awful 4s. To Tasha's mind, her sister would have been better to have named him Damien, but he was the apple of his grandfather's eye. As though to prove her point, her dad reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handful of sweets, which he traded for Mason's weapon of choice. What a marvellous idea to fill him full of sugar just before he would be expected to sit quietly through a service where his new baby sister would be the centre of attention. Seizing the opportunity to distract her mother, Tasha rearranged her features into an exaggerated frown. I thought Danni was trying to restrict Mason's sugar intake. Her mother's head whipped around, and she gave an outraged squawk as she thrust the fascinator towards Tasha. Adrian! Adrian! Victoria's heels beat a staccato rhythm across the car park as she marched towards her startled husband. He cast a baleful look at Tasha, who grinned and waved. Serves you right. Still smiling, she tossed the hideous fascinator back into the boot and pulled it shut with a firm click. Knowing it wouldn't take long for her mother's attention to wheel back in her direction, Tasha made a break for it and hurried over to where her sister was holding court on the steps of the church. She knew it was but Danielle looked positively radiant. The skirt of her long-sleeved navy dress fell from the empire line beneath the bosom in a forgiving wave of narrow pleats that neatly disguised any post-pregnancy weight she might still be carrying around her waist and hips. Pretty white daisies decorated the dark background, adding a sunny touch. In her arms, baby Luna snoozed contentedly in a froth of lace that might have once been cream, but was now golden with age. Somewhere in the collection of photographs that littered the walls and surfaces of her parents' home were pictures of a beaming Victoria holding both Tasha and Danni dressed in that same family christening gown. As Tasha approached, Danni's hazel eyes lit up and a smile wreathed her face as she juggled the sleeping baby into one arm so she could wrap the other around Tasha's shoulders. "Hello, you." "Hello, you." Tasha hugged her back, careful to arch her body so Luna wasn't squashed between them. "You look bloody amazing." Releasing her hold, Tasha bent to drop the softest of kisses on Luna's forehead, then stepped back. "Hello, darling girl. I hope you're going to be good for your Auntie Tasha today." "With any luck, she'll sleep right through." They exchanged a rueful look, and Tasha could tell her sister was recalling how an outraged, red-faced Mason had objected to the vicar dripping water on his forehead by unleashing the kind of hideous poomageddon only very small babies were capable of. Thankfully, Tasha had been excused godparent duties in favour of Danni's brother and sister-in-law, but even sitting in the second row of pews the smell had been enough to turn her stomach. "You look very—" Danni trailed off with a shrug and a smile as she surveyed Tasha's outfit. "Pink," Tasha said with a laugh. Danni had always been the one with style, and though she was the youngest by 18 months, she'd declared her older sister an absolute fashion disaster when they were teenagers and had insisted on taking charge of her wardrobe. More interested in books than boys, Tasha had shrugged and let Danni get on with it. It was something Danni enjoyed, and it had saved Tasha the bother, so a win-win as far as she'd been concerned. "You know I can't be trusted in a shop on my own." Danni grinned. "You let the assistant bully you again, didn't you?" She brushed a hand over the label. "The fit is great on you." Her gaze lifted. Bless her sister for always finding a way to make Tasha feel good about herself. Danni shifted closer, her body turning to block the other people standing on the step as she lowered her voice to whisper, "I can't thank you enough for agreeing to be Luna's godmother. I know I'm asking a lot of you." Tasha pressed a kiss to her sister's cheek, her heart swelling with love. They might be like chalk and cheese, but Danni and she were lucky to be the best of friends as well as sisters. "It's my absolute honour. And as for everything else..." Tasha forced herself to look past her sister to where Danni's husband, Stuart, was chatting to a group of his friends, including the man who was going to be Luna's godfather. "That's all water under the bridge." "Oh, I know that, but it's still putting you in an awkward position. But Johnny is Stuart's best friend." The last words were said in a tone that begged for forgiveness and understanding. "It's fine." Tasha cupped her sister's cheek so she could hold her gaze. "And it's not going to be awkward, because I'm not going to let it be." She'd sworn she'd never let Johnny Roberts hurt her again, and though it had taken a few years for the embarrassment and hurt to fade, Tasha had no regrets about where her life had ended up. She pecked one more kiss on Danni's cheek, then moved around her, holding her arms open as she approached her brother-in-law. "Hello, Stu." "Tash, you made it! I must say I was a bit worried when I saw the forecast this morning. Was it horrendous?" Stuart swept her into a bear hug, pulling her so close Tasha ended up on her tiptoes. He was an affectionate, warm-hearted man, always ready with a hug and a smile, and Tasha adored him because he made Danni so happy. "Put me down before you wrinkle me," Tasha said, fending him off with a laugh as he smacked a big kiss on her cheek. "The rain was awful for the first hour, but once I got off the motorway it cheered up." She lifted her eyes to check the sky, but there was no sign of the dark clouds that had dogged the first part of her journey. "Let's hope it stays like this for the rest of the day." "From your lips to the ears of the weather gods, we'll be hanging on to the marquee trying to stop it from blowing away." Stuart slung a friendly arm around her shoulders. "You staying with the parental units tonight?" "Like they'd let me stay anywhere else," Tasha replied with a laugh. I warned Mum I have to be up at stupid o'clock tomorrow to get back to work in time for the Monday morning team meeting, but you know she'll still be up before me, making sure I have breakfast before... For all she drove Tasha mad with her endless fussing, everything her mum did for her came from a place of love. She just wished sometimes that love came with a similar level of acceptance. Stuart grinned. We told your folks we would be happy to hire the parish hall for the party today, and I thought your mum's head might explode at the suggestion. Well, your parents hosted Mason's party, so I guess they wanted to make sure they're doing their bit. It had made sense for the O'Neills to take the lead then, because Stuart's older brother and sister-in-law had been chosen as Mason's godparents. But her mother was the queen of hosting parties, and there was no way she would let the opportunity pass her by twice. I know. He leaned in closer and whispered in Tasha's ear. Don't ever have kids, Tash, because your life will never be your own again. When he leaned back, he was still smiling, but Tash knew him well enough to catch the tension around the edges of his mouth. Unlike Tasha, who'd had the sense to move away, both Stu and Danni had chosen to return home after university, finding jobs and a small place in Ipswich that had allowed them to save up until a property had become available in the village. Tasha's parents had kicked in a chunk of cash to help with the deposit. They'd offered to do the same for Tasha, but she'd told them she preferred to stand on her own 2 feet. Although that had been part of it, she'd known that if she had agreed, then the pressure would start for her to find somewhere in the local area, and she definitely preferred to keep her distance. She'd got a good deal on a rental property through her job, and that suited her just fine. Chin up, she said, giving her brother-in-law a consoling pat on the shoulder. It's only for another 18 years or so. Stuart groan-laughed. Ouch, Tash, that's just mean. His face turned serious. You okay about today? She rolled her eyes. Not you as well. Johnny and I are old history. He's happy, I'm happy. The end. Did I hear my name? The man who Tasha once thought she'd spend the rest of her life with broke away from the rest of the group and turned to them with a familiar smile. His blue eyes still twinkled with the promise of adventures. The cowlick in his fringe still caused his blonde hair to part in a just off-centre wave that had a tendency to flop into his eyes if he let it grow too long. His tall frame was still the same as when he'd held her long into the night, as they'd whispered to each other their hopes and dreams for the future. And yet, he was like a stranger to her, and she was the one who'd changed. Either way, there was a moment's pause when she waited for a flicker of that connection between them to reignite, and nothing but relief when it didn't. I was just saying how happy I am to see you. The lie rolled easily off her tongue. She had forgiven him for what he'd done to her, if only because letting go of that painful episode had enabled her to move on. But they were never going to be friends. Tasha made a point of turning to include the woman hovering just behind Johnny's shoulder in her welcoming smile. It's great to see both of you. You look well, Lauren. And fully clothed, which was always a bonus. Tasha kept the little barb to herself, while letting the black humour of it warm her inside. Forgiveness hadn't turned her into a martyr. Holding the smile, she extended it to the little blonde angel holding tightly to her mother's hand. This can't be Willow, can it? Goodness me, you are all grown up. The last time she'd seen Johnny and Lauren's daughter, she'd been not much more than a babe in arms at a New Year's Eve party her parents had thrown. Somehow it had slipped her mother's mind to mention she'd invited the Roberts clan. Then again, she'd invited the whole village, so excluding them would have only set tongues wagging, and Tasha had had more than enough of that to last her a lifetime. Mummy's got a baby in her tummy, Willow declared. The deep furrow etched between her brows said she wasn't entirely enamoured with the idea. Tasha felt the edges of her smile tighten just a little as Lauren tried and failed to shush her daughter, while those around turned to call out their congratulations. Tasha didn't need to look up to know more than one of those well-wishers would be training their hawk-like gazes on her, waiting for a reaction. Not giving them a moment of satisfaction, Tasha kept her attention fixed on Willow. "Well, isn't that lovely? Are you looking forward to having a baby brother or sister?" "No, I told Mummy to send it back." Tasha had to bite her lip and turn away before Willow saw her laughing. Unfortunately, the motion brought her face to face with Johnny, who was frowning in concern. "I'm sorry about that. We were trying to keep things quiet for now." Tasha raised her brows at that, but refused the temptation to point out that expecting a small child to keep that kind of momentous news a secret was a bit stupid. Then again, she liked to steal a lot of things. Tasha pushed the mean thought away. Lauren wasn't the one to blame, and, besides, she'd done Tasha a favour in the long run. "Why on earth would you think you need to apologise to me? What you and Lauren get up to is entirely your own business, but Danni might not be quite so forgiving." Johnny winced. "You still know how and where to stick the knife, don't you, Tash?" "And you still seem confused about how little it matters to me what's happening in your life. I'll see you at the font, Johnny. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a few more people I need to say hello to before we start." Chapter 2. "Happy Valentine's Day, Rhys!" Rhys quirked his lips into something approximating a smile at Martha Shaw's enthusiastic greeting. "Thanks, Martha. Have you been inundated with cards and gifts from all your secret admirers?" "Oh, behave yourself!" The middle-aged owner of Stourton in the Vale's village store rolled her eyes, but Rhys didn't miss the way she grinned to herself as she turned back to the display fridge she was filling. Rhys had a lot of time for Martha and her husband Joe, who had moved to the village 5 years earlier and taken over the then rather run-down shop. Tired of London life, they'd decided to take a risk and put their savings into a completely new venture. With an eye for what visitors in the area would like, as well as providing a service to the local community, they'd expanded the shop into an empty building next door and now ran one of the most popular shops in the area. You could get everything from a daily paper and a pint of milk, including a variety of non-dairy options, to fresh lemongrass and dried fennel seeds. "Is Joe about?" Rhys asked her as he helped himself to one of the baskets by the door and took out his phone to check the list his mother had dictated to him when he'd made the mistake of mentioning he was nipping out to the shop. He glanced down at the basket in his hand, back at the list, and swapped the basket for one of the larger ones on wheels. "Just a few bits. My arse." "He's doing a few deliveries, but shouldn't be more than about 10 minutes. Martha looked back over her shoulder. "On a Sunday? Business must be booming." Martha sighed. "If only. It's the only way to compete with the big supermarkets, though. If you're in a hurry, I can get him to give you a call when he's back." Rhys nodded. "It's tough all round, and I know us closing up early last summer didn't help things." "We know why your family did what they did, and no one around here blames you for it, Rhys. All we can do is hope for a..." It was good of her to say so, but Rhys still felt they'd failed the community by not finding a better way to head things off. "That's certainly the plan. I'll hang on for a bit if you don't think Joe will be too long." Rhys held up his phone with a smile, hoping to lift the mood. "Besides, it'll take me a while to find all this stuff Mum needs." Martha picked up the now empty crate by her feet and placed it behind the counter before walking towards Rhys with a smile. "Why don't you read out the list to me? It'll be much quicker." "You're a lifesaver." Rhys followed Martha around the shop, reading out each item in turn. They crisscrossed the place 6 times, the list not in any order other than as things had occurred to his mum. He apologised when they ended up at the same section for the 3rd time. "I should have organised my list a bit better." "It's fine. It's not like we're busy at the moment." Martha plucked a loaf of sourdough from the shelf and placed it in his basket. "What's next?" "Coconut milk, then fresh coriander, and we're done." "That's in the next aisle. So, how are things up at Juniper Meadows?" she asked as she led him around to the next aisle, then towards a display of fresh herbs and vegetables near the refrigerated section. "Busy, as always. Better now the snow's cleared. Again." After a bright, mostly dry autumn, winter had arrived in the Vale with a serious bang just before Christmas and dumped one load of snow after another. Just when they thought they'd got over the worst of it, another storm had blown through to coat the ground in yet another blanket of white. It might look beautiful if you were tucked up by the fire with a hot drink, but when you ran a farm it was an endless slog of wet boots, frozen fingers and stalled engines. "I think last weekend was supposed to be the last of it," Martha observed. "Well, that's what the forecasters said." "We live in hope," Rhys replied. "I've got so much to do to get things up and running with the campsite, but I'm stuck until the weather improves and the ground dries out a bit." Martha turned to face him, and he didn't miss the eagerness in her smile as she said, "You're opening up again this year. We did wonder after everything that happened." A disgruntled former employee had waged a campaign of destruction on the estate, including setting a fire that had threatened the campsite. It had taken weeks to deal with all the refunds and cancellations that had followed, and their income had taken a serious hit. Thanks to his Uncle Ziggy's cautious oversight, the estate had had deep reserves they could call upon to tide them over, and the whole family had worked hard to put on a number of events at the back end of the year, including a very popular Halloween weekend to make. Rhys hadn't made the most of the opportunities afforded by the campsite because the farm had simply taken up too much of his time, but he was determined to put that right this year. "That's what I wanted to talk to Joe about, and you, of course. I've advertised for someone to come in and manage the camping business on the estate. I should be interviewing candidates in early March with a view to them starting as soon as possible after that. I want to expand what we've been doing with a view to making Juniper Meadows one of the most sought-after holiday spots in the area. Would you still be interested in running the satellite shop?" As the campsite had grown over the years, they'd added facilities like a shower block and a small shop to supply guests with a few essentials Rhys had picked up from the cash and carry. Joe had come to him with a proposal that he and Martha take it over, and the arrangement had suited everyone, especially the guests, who'd seen a vast improvement in service. "Oh, definitely! We've had loads of ideas about what we can do to increase what we offer for people staying. Have you seen these?" Martha turned to point at the fridge next to them. A sign covered in hearts announced a Valentine's Day meal deal beneath which Martha had grouped together ingredients in wicker baskets, each with a recipe card sticking out. A selection of wine and champagne was displayed next to the baskets. "I was thinking we could do something like this, but base it around barbecue items or one-pot cooking." Rhys picked up a card and scanned the clear and simple instructions for making coq au vin. He did his share around the farmhouse. Everyone took it in turns to pitch in. But he was a rank amateur at cooking compared to the rest of the family. With something like this to follow, he doubted even he'd be able to mess things up. "This is really great. Did you make these yourself?" Martha nodded. "It didn't take much, as we already had the laminator." There was a little glow on her cheek, as if she was a touch embarrassed but pleased with herself at the same time. "You can take one to try if you like." Rhys tucked the card back into the basket with a rueful smile. "I'm sure they'll be in great demand today, so I'd hate to deprive some desperate husband later who's left it to the last minute. Besides," he added with a laugh, "it's a lot to eat for one person." There was no point in pretending he was anything other than single, because the whole village would know every detail about his love life. Or rather, the lack of it. I heard about Amelia and Ben moving in together, Martha said, which only went to prove his point. He didn't miss the hint of sympathy in her tone, but resolutely ignored it. He and Amelia were old news long before his long-lost cousin had returned to the family the previous autumn, although the die-hard romantics among the local population had... "It's great, isn't it? They're such a good match for each other." He glanced down at the list on his phone. "Fresh coriander?" He nudged Martha back to his shopping and away from the subject. Rhys had no hard feelings about his ex-girlfriend and his cousin getting together. It was true what he'd said before. Ben was much better suited to Amelia than Rhys had ever been. They shared an artistic temperament, whereas Rhys liked practical, tangible things he could control. He could admire and appreciate paintings, but they didn't speak to him, and had certainly never moved his soul enough to ever consider picking up a pencil or a brush and trying to create something himself. Much to his mother's chagrin. "Oh, of course." A couple of minutes later, he was standing at the counter waiting to pay when his phone rang. "Hello, Dad. What's up?" "Lemons! I need more lemons! Are you still at the shop? The ones I've got have gone mouldy and I've already started the mix." "I'm still here. Hold on a sec." Rhys headed back to the fresh fruit and veg section. "How many do you need?" he asked, as he picked up a net bag with 6 lemons in it. "About 50. The whole tray is rotten. What the hell am I going to do? If I stop now, I'll lose the rest of the ingredients as well." Rhys could almost picture his father pacing up and down, one hand thrust into his wild hair as he lamented. "There's only 2 small bags here. Hang on, let me check with Martha." Rhys pressed the phone to his chest while he explained his father's dilemma. "Do you have any more stock out the back?" Martha shook her head. "Sorry, Joe's going to head over to the wholesalers once he's finished the deliveries. Can it wait until this afternoon?" "I don't think so." Rhys didn't get that involved with his father's gin and liqueur making, but he knew enough to know that it all revolved around delicate timing once a batch was started. Martha frowned for a second, then her brow cleared as she hurried from behind the counter towards one of the shelves. She held up a bottle and grinned at him. "Well, concentrate, do? It's pancake day next week, so we've got extra stock in." Disaster averted, Rhys loaded the shopping into the boot of his Range Rover with the distinctive Juniper Meadows logos on the door and bonnet and headed away from the village on the short drive to the entrance gates of the estate. His phone rang again as he turned onto the sweeping drive, and he pressed the button on his steering wheel with a grin. "I'll be 5 minutes, Dad. Calm down." "Oh, darling, you managed to speak to your father, then?" His mother's voice. "I'll just nip to the stable yard and then I'll be home with your stuff." "You're a good boy." Rhys grinned. Whether he was 3 or 30, he would always be his mother's good boy. "I was starting to think I'd have to drive into town," his mother continued. "And you know how much I hate that supermarket car park? Plus, I've got a new aromatherapist to interview for the spa in an hour and I didn't want to cancel her." Together with Stevie, Rowena ran the hotel and spa that now occupied their former ancestral home of Stourton Hall in the heart of the estate's parkland. "Get her to do a practical demonstration on you, Ma. You sound like you need it. Don't worry about Dad. That's all in hand and I'll unpack the shopping and put everything away when I get back to the farmhouse." "Oh, what a good idea. Are you sure you won't join us for supper tonight?" "No, thank you." Gatecrashing his parents' romantic evening dinner was not his idea of a good time. "There's a new series on Netflix I've been meaning to catch up on." His mother sighed. "I don't like the idea of you all on your own, not on a special day like today." "It's only a special day for retailers, Ma. Besides, it's your fault I'm still single. You and Dad set such a high bar when it comes to love. I can't just settle for anyone." If you never set foot off the estate, how are you ever going to meet someone, though? Even the Fates need a bit of help to do their job. The Fates. Rhys did roll his eyes at that one. Love you, Ma. I've got to go. Bye. Chapter 3. He hung up without waiting for a reply because he couldn't face another one of his mother's long laments about his single status. It was easy for her. From everything they'd told him, it had been love at first sight for his parents, and they were still head over heels for each other 30-odd years later. Fates indeed. Where did she come up with such rubbish? He adored both his parents, but it was something of a mystery to all of them how the child of two such free spirits had grown up with a determined, some might say ruthless, sense of duty to his family and the estate. Then again, as the second-born male of his generation, even if there was only a matter of minutes separating his father Zap from his twin brother Ziggy, his dad had never really understood what it meant to be the heir. Though his father, his uncle, and their sister Stevie had been at pains to raise both Rhys and Stevie's daughter Hope without any expectations that they should stick around at Juniper Meadows if their hopes and dreams had taken them elsewhere, they'd both chosen to tie their futures, then who else was going to do it? Abdicating his responsibilities in the selfish way his grandfather had done would only pass the burden on to someone else. Growing up, it hadn't felt like such a big deal. If he'd stayed single, as Ziggy had until very recently, then the title would pass through Hope to any children she might have. Unfortunately, when their family title had been created by Henry VIII, women had been viewed as little more than commodities, especially those of the aristocracy. Useful for building alliances with other families and for breeding the next generation, but that was about it. Like many others, the barony could only be passed through the male line. But since Ben had come home to them, Rhys had found himself thinking much more about the future. He loved his cousin enough to recognise that while he was sure Ben could step up if needed to, the weight of running the estate would surely snuff out the precious flame of his artistic talent. Plus, with Ben back on the scene, Hope, or at least any children she might have one day, had been pushed one step further from the title. Hope had never said anything to imply she felt any resentment about the situation. But then again, Rhys hadn't asked her about it. There'd been so much turmoil in the family lately. Maybe it would be better to let everything settle down for a bit. Or maybe Rhys was looking for an excuse to continue to avoid raising something he'd always felt guilty about. If there was any justice in the world, then Hope would have been the one to inherit, because she was better at seeing the bigger picture and getting the right people in rather than trying to do it all herself. Rhys was working on being less of an overbearing arse, one of the many painful and painfully accurate accusations Amelia had thrown at him in the dying days of their relationship. But he was definitely still a work in progress in that area. Hope had more patience and was much better suited to the people management side of things. She had an easy way about her, much like Ziggy, and for a long time Rhys had been happy to let her take on all the stuff about the estate he hated, while he looked after the farm. Knowing he couldn't keep letting Hope take most of the strain, Rhys had stepped up and had taken on the additional responsibilities of the campsite, but it had proven incompatible with running the farm. Animals didn't stick to nice, coordinated schedules. They didn't care if he had new visitors to check in, or if the drains in the showers were blocked. He couldn't ask the cows to wait to be milked or stick up a sign on a broken fence line asking the sheep not to stray past it until it could be repaired. When they'd had to close the campsite as a precaution during last summer's troubles, it had been almost a relief. He was letting the side down, had been letting the rest of the family down in the... That was why he'd decided to advertise for a manager on the camping business, someone with the right knowledge and skills who could not only take over the day-to-day running, but drive things forward and maximise the potential. As he parked in front of the distillery and climbed out, Rhys wondered if perhaps he should do the same for his personal life. But how to go about advertising for the position of future Baron's wife? It wasn't the kind of thing he could stick in a dating app profile because the kind of women who would be attracted to the idea were probably the least suited to it. Besides, he didn't have the time to go out on one, never mind dozens of dates. Maybe he needed the fates to intervene after all. He shook his head at the thought and popped open the boot to retrieve his father's emergency lemons. "Hello, stranger!" Rhys turned around and almost dropped the box he was holding as he was engulfed in a waft of perfume and an unexpected hug. He couldn't step back, trapped as he was against the rear of the Range Rover, so he had to wait for the woman to release him. "Oh, Lydia! Hi! What are you doing here?" Lydia Castor Hardwick lived over the border in Oxfordshire on an estate that put Juniper Meadows to shame. The Castor Hardwicks weren't family friends as such, but they'd always included them in invitations to parties, Christmas drinks and the like, and his parents had been too polite to refuse. Thankfully, they lived far enough away that the enforced socialising was limited to once or twice a year. Lydia's older brother, Hugo, was also an heir, but to a much grander title, his father being an earl. Rhys and he should have probably been friends given their similar stations in life, but Hugo had always had too much of a sense of his own importance and made clear his disgust that both Rhys and Hope had gone to the local comprehensive school rather than to public school. Rhys's father, uncles and aunt had all been packed off to boarding school at their grandfather's insistence and had hated every moment of it. There was no way Zap had been prepared to put Rhys through that, and he'd been happy to remain at home and scribble through his homework sitting next to Hope at the large kitchen table, around which much of their lives played out. Though not a snob like her brother, Lydia was the very essence of a country lady in her Barber jacket and Hunter Wellington boots, long hair held back from her face with a sensible headband. "I just popped over to see Jason," Lydia replied, with a wide smile that showed every one of her perfect white teeth as she gestured towards one of the artisan workshops that were the lifeblood of the old stable yard. "I snapped the girth on Moonlight's saddle and it needed repairing." "Isn't it a bit out of your way to come? But was he drive an hour each way good?" "Oh, I didn't come here only to see Jason." She reached out to smooth the collar on his shirt, a proprietorial gesture that made Rhys instantly uncomfortable. That discomfort was only compounded by her next words. "I came here to see you." He tried to take a step back, but bumped up against the Range Rover again. "Why would you want to see me?" "Because I think we could be good together." She said it so matter-of-factly. I'm flattered, I guess, but, Oh, goodness!" Her laughter pealed out. "Oh, dear, I'm afraid you misunderstood me." Rhys heaved a sigh of relief. "Thank God for that. I'm sorry, Lydia. It's not that you're not an attractive woman. I mean, of course, you are. And you're a very handsome man, which, of course, helps tremendously when it comes to these kind of arrangements. Poor Grizzy's husband is such a dull little weed. And those teeth, oh!" She shuddered. "I don't know how she lets him anywhere near her, but at least we wouldn't have any problem in that department." Was he going mad? "Look, Lydia, I really don't understand what you're driving at here." He rather feared that he did, but it didn't seem possible. "Are you talking about the two of us?" "Getting married? Yes, exactly." "But we don't know each other." "We've known each other since we were children." She folded her arms and cast a critical eye up and down him. "I'm not angling for a love match, if that's what you're worried about. All I ask is that you're civil to me and kind when the time comes and we need to start a family. Other than that, I don't mind much what you get up to as long as you're discreet about it." He really had stumbled into the twilight zone. Not only was she suggesting they get married, but she was all but giving him carte blanche to be unfaithful. What the hell kind of upbringing had she had if this was her idea of an acceptable relationship? I'm sure you'd have your choice of partners. He hadn't just been polite when he'd told her she was attractive, but acknowledging that as a fact and feeling a personal attraction to someone were two very different things. If this was an example of the way she thought, then Rhys was absolutely sure they would not make a successful match. I don't understand why you've approached me. She shrugged. Daddy's been making noise. I've been the mistress at our estate since Mummy passed, and I'm not looking forward to ceding my place to someone else. So you thought you'd come here and be mistress instead? Why not? Look at it this way. If we did get married, then you wouldn't have to keep messing around with these open days and whatnot. She made a disparaging gesture towards a poster stuck in the cafe window advertising their Easter activities. I'm sure Daddy would make a most handsome settlement to whomever I marry, and I hold a considerable income in my own right left to me by my mother. She was looking at him as though she'd just dealt him a winning hand. But all he could feel was incredibly sorry for her. Imagine thinking the only way you could find a husband was to basically try and sell yourself to them. I'm sorry, Lydia, but I'm not the right man for you. I wish you well, and I hope one day you'll find a man who will appreciate you for your many personal attributes, and not for the value of your inheritance. Instead of looking upset, she merely shook her head. I thought you had more sense than the rest of your family, but I see you're as hopelessly romantic as the rest of them. If that was supposed to be an insult, she really didn't know him at all. Take care, Lydia. She pulled a pen out of her coat pocket, and before Rhys realised what she was planning, she closed the gap between them, grasped his wrist, and scribbled a row of numbers on the back of his hand. My mobile, she said as she stepped back. It's the best way to get hold of me if you should change your mind. Rhys resisted the urge to scrub his hand on the back of his jeans. His skin felt dirty, and he wanted nothing more than to wash it off. I have to go. Lydia gave him one more up-and-down look that made him feel like a prize bull at market. Think about it. In time, you'll come to see it makes sense for both of us. Before he could reply, she turned on her heel and strode across the courtyard towards the visitors' car park, her long, dark hair swinging in a perfect curtain down her back. There you are! What took you so long? Is that Lydia? What's she doing here? Rhys turned to where his